Sound. The cinema is a complete sensory experience, from the visuals on the giant screen, to the smells of the butter and popcorn, to the sound so loud it reverberates within your chest. But movies didn't always have sound. In the beginning, they were silent. They were accompanied by a pianist or a small orchestra who would play music along with the film to help guide the audience with the emotional cues of the movie that they were watching. With the rise of synchronization technology, the talkie was born. Audiences loved it, and silent movies were no more. Of course, 2011's The Artist proved that there's still an appetite for a silent movie, but I would argue that the convention mainly works because the protagonist is himself a silent movie actor struggling with the sudden rise of talkies. What makes The Artist work so brilliantly as a silent movie is that it perfectly isolates the audience from the synchronized sound that we're used to today. We're not watching George's story in a literal sense. George, the character, has a voice and the ability to hear. Instead, by framing his story in the construct of a silent movie, we're viewing his life, his story, his narrative through the lens of his career. The story of The Artist is the story of a silent movie star fighting against a rapidly changing industry. The story of a man struggling to find his cinematic voice. By viewing his life through the lens of how he saw his own career, the audience is given a much closer look into the mindset of the protagonist. This is no more apparent than the first moment in the film where we hear synchronized sound. George sets down a glass. In a normal film, or life for that matter, we'd think nothing of this sound. But because this film is presented to us as a silent movie, this innocuous action instantly transports us into the surreal. We react to it as George reacts to it. We also know immediately that this is not reality for George, as he is as surprised as we are to hear it. But he shouldn't be, because in his reality, he has the capacity to hear. His reaction tells us that nothing we're seeing is literal. George's true nightmare in this is not that he can hear sound, but that he has no voice. He's in this unusual, overwhelming world of sound, but he cannot speak. His fear is that he can hear everything, but say nothing. While it would certainly be possible to tell a different story in the style of a silent movie, The Artist's success is in making synchronized sound as foreign to the audience as it is to its protagonist. And this only works in the context of George being a silent movie star. Let me take a moment to describe a term, diegesis. Diegesis describes the narrative. To say something is diegetic is to say that it is contained within the narrative. The easiest example to give is sound. A score that the audience can hear, but the characters cannot hear, is considered non-diegetic. It's not part of the narrative. It's part of the film, but it's not part of the actual story that's being told. If the characters are listening to headphones and you can hear the music, that's considered diegetic sound. It's within the story, the characters can interact with it directly, it's part of the narrative. 2018's A Quiet Place tells the story of a family struggling to survive after the sudden arrival of creatures that kill anything that make a noise. And while the film undeniably has an alien antagonist, the aliens themselves are only a menace when summoned by another character, the true villain of the film, Noise. When every twig snapped or crunched leaf means life or death, sound itself becomes an antagonist. A character that the family must fight against. The sound design is exacting. It amplifies the tiny, everyday sounds that we don't even register, giving them cinematic weight. At times, director John Krasinski takes us into the perspective of Regan, the daughter of the family who's deaf, and then we are left, like her, unable to perceive the ever-present threat around her, hiding the true villain of the film, like the ocean hid the shark in Jaws. The film is largely acted in silent, with characters communicating with sign language and looks. Where in The Artist, the acting was exaggerated because they needed to overcome the lack of sound. In A Quiet Place, everything is reserved Any wrong movement, any wrong motion can cause unexpected sound and summon the ever-present danger that lurks around them. The brain is a funny thing when it comes to sound. It always needs stimuli. They say if you go into an anechoic chamber, that is a room that's designed to absorb all sound, if you sit quiet long enough, you begin to hear your body in ways you've never heard it before. The blood flowing through your ears, your lungs expanding and contracting. Some people say they can even hear their heart beating. The sound design of A Quiet Place is great. The focus on all the little sounds that really heighten your sense of hearing and make you extra sensitive to everything that's happening. It's not without a few discordant parts, like when the son hops out of an old pickup truck, and those springs would be creaky. But for the most part, the amplification of these tiny sounds is incredibly effective at heightening our awareness of sound as an integral part of the narrative. The film remains quiet for the majority of the opening act. We're allowed to hear the tiny details of sound usually forgotten in films. Accordingly, the score is unobtrusive. Even when it's present, it allows those small sounds to punch through. And while it does use a couple orchestra hits to ratchet up the acoustic tension, but they never overpower the primary sound of the opening third of the film: silence. There is one musical moment. Evelyn comes to Lee with an iPod while wearing headphones. They share a dance briefly before she offers him one of the earbuds. We can hear the music diegetically, but as soon as she puts the headphone on him, it quickly overpowers everything around them, giving them a moment of refuge within the very thing that can get them killed. That we're taken to this musical refuge with the characters allows the audience to unconsciously intrude on this intimate moment between these two characters. A few minutes later, we're given a second reprieve when Lee explains to his son by a river that constant loud ambient sounds can mask out smaller sounds. And here, for the first time in the film, the characters speak at normal levels.
Why didn't you let her come? Do you blame her for what happened?
It was no one's fault.
What's interesting to me about this moment is the almost jarring nature of hearing characters speak normally. Much like George's dream scene in The Artist, the bizarreness of hearing such a normal sound in that context.
Of course I do.
Here, their voices act as that glass. Structurally, this moment of reprieve also works to reset the acoustic tension in the film. Our ears are given a moment to relax, to stop paying attention to every pin drop, because the tension is about to start ratcheting up again. While A Quiet Place is not a silent movie like The Artist, it is a film which amplifies its silence. Okay, this is a spoiler warning for Portrait of a Lady on Fire for two reasons. A, it's a wonderful film and you should just see it if you can. And B, I have to talk about the ending. This is your warning. Portrait of a Lady on Fire is a 2019 French film directed by Céline Sciamma. On its surface, it seems like a conventional period drama. At first, you might not even notice what's missing. But the score is missing. In fact, the sound design for this film is entirely diegetic. What we see and hear is what the characters see and hear. And I think this is a fascinating choice for a film that tells us that a portrait is much more than a straight recreation of reality, but an interpretation of both how an artist sees a subject and, equally important, how that subject sees its artist. There's something I love about the juxtaposition of the ideas of the film and the fact that it presents itself as almost entirely literal. The trick here, however, is that the film is largely told as a flashback, and only towards the end does it even open up the door for the surreal. Only after Eloise and Marianne have made their feelings known to each other, as if Marianne, the narrator's memory, is becoming less reliable as to the literal events of her time with Eloise as their emotional connection crescendos. The focus on the literal in Portrait of a Lady on Fire is no more apparent than with the lack of score. As I said at the beginning of this video, music has been a part of filmmaking since the beginning. Even when films were silent, they were accompanied by music solely for the benefit of the audience. This film does away with that convention entirely, forcing the audience into the most literal experience watching these women falling for each other in the most raw and visceral way, with just the sound of a crackling fire.
C'est un tableau de mon père.
The ruffling of cloth, or the creaks and footsteps on the old wooden floors. There's no score to separate us from the characters. We're forced into proximity with these women, into the room with them, and guided only by their actions and emotion for our own emotional cues. The interior shots are often framed portrait-like. The lack of score isn't the only way Sciamma uses sound to place us close to Marianne and Eloise. A major theme of Portrait is isolation. Whether it's Marianne, isolated from society, forced to use her father's name to showcase her work, Eloise, fearing marriage to an unknown man in a foreign city, or the isolation that comes from pursuing love forbidden by the culture that they live in, both by being a same-sex relationship, but also because of their incongruous social classes. Sound is used to highlight the isolation of the characters. The intimate quiet of the estate is surrounded by the ocean, a barrier that physically isolates them from the world at large, but the constant roar of the sea is also a place to escape the quiet tension from the manor itself. Fitting then that this would be the location of their first kiss, where they can finally unmask their feelings for each other while hidden from the rest of the world. Also, they have to take their masks off to kiss, for symbolism. But this leads me back to the lack of the score. While the lack of a musical soundtrack allows the audience to exist with the character and follow their emotional journey earnestly, it also punctuates the three musical moments in a profound way. The first moment, Eloise and Marianne are talking about the orchestra. Eloise remarks that she wants to go to Mass to hear the organ music, as it's the only music she knows. Marianne is somewhat taken aback that she's never heard an orchestra and attempts to play her favorite piece on a harpsichord. As I've said before, orchestral music has been a part of film since the days of the silent movie. And by removing the score, the audience has been deprived of those familiar sounds that typically underscore films. As an audience, we understand the difference between a harpsichord and an orchestra. And just as Marianne struggles to remember the song, frustrated that she can't properly do justice to this music for Eloise, we understand why it's so frustrating for her. Eloise, on the other hand, is endeared by Marianne's attempt to share the song with her, even as she's messing it up. She never loses the slight smile because it's who's playing that's important, not how well she's playing it. Her emotion doesn't shift when Marianne gives up playing, but when Marianne mentions Milan, reminding her that much like the song that Marianne's been trying to play for her, this memory, will slowly begin to fade away. Now, I know this is a video about sound, but I want to take a second to recognize the visuals of the shot here. Eloise is fully recognizing her feelings for Marianne. And Marianne is framed with a fireplace over her shoulder, giving her the appearance that she herself is on fire. Fire is a strong motif throughout this film. Obviously, it's called Portrait of a Lady on Fire, so you'd expect it to be a strong element. But more than just the visuals of fire, the sound of the fire crackling in the fireplace is often the only thing you hear.
Pourquoi? Que je ne l'ai pas assez interdit à sa sœur.
The second musical moment in this film is set around a bonfire. The bonfire that is the moment of inspiration for the titular portrait. It is at this bonfire that Marianne and Eloise both finally recognize their feelings for each other. What really adds to the transcendental nature of this scene is the haunting choral number that overlays it. The song starts discordant, nebulous in origin. You don't quite know what you're hearing or where it's coming from. It resolves into voices of the other women around the fire as groups of them add their voices to the increasingly complex melody. And this time, Marianne sees Eloise as part of the fire, through the embers and the heat distortion. As Marianne finally recognizes Eloise's feelings for her and her feelings for Eloise, the roar of the fire comes back into the mix. Reverb begins to be added to the voices of the singers, and for once, as Marianne is finally no longer able to suppress her feelings for Eloise, the sound transcends the real and becomes something more. The audience, for the first time in the film, is not hearing what the characters are experiencing. It's no longer diegetic. We don't hear the voices of the women who come to extinguish the fire on Eloise's dress. We don't hear Eloise fall to the ground. Instead, we hear the continuance of the song, the continuance of that emotional connection between the two women. And it carries them and us immediately back to that cave on the beach where, hidden from the world around them, they share their first kiss. And like Eloise, who does not react to being on fire except to look back to Marianne, the separation of the music from the diegesis fully captures that feeling between the two women, that they are the only thing that matters in this moment. The third and final use of music in this film is the final shot. A 2.5-minute shot of Eloise in the box of a symphony hall as we push into her face and she takes in the full beauty of Vivaldi's Summer Movement, the piece Marianne had been trying to play for her on the harpsichord in its full orchestral majesty. This musical callback finishes the song Marianne was unable to finish, fully realized and powerful. Eloise is finally able to hear the song as it was intended to be heard. The absence of a score for the rest of this film makes this moment so much more powerful. There is no other sound in the film like this orchestra. The choral number is unfamiliar. Marianne's harpsichord version is incomplete, a poor facsimile. When you finally hear it, it's overwhelmingly powerful and emotional. And when you combine the music with the shot, which is solely on Eloise, and beautifully acted by Adele Haenel, she both mourns the relationship that could not be and revels in the power and beauty of the music she's hearing. The audience has been forced to read emotions based on the performances of the actresses alone for the duration of the film. And now it is all brought to a climax in a close-up filled with raw and complex emotions. It is the only thing we are allowed to see in this moment. Music has driven emotion in film since the days of the silent movie. And Portrait of a Lady on Fire, by largely depriving us of that convention and then unleashing it at the end, is one of the single best moments in film I've ever experienced. When I was first writing the script for this, I had a general thought of what would it mean for a film to be a silent movie with today's technology. And the artist is literally a silent movie in the old convention. And that's, on the surface, I guess what I was thinking. But with A Quiet Place, using sound and silence in juxtaposing them and turning sound into a character, it is a silence movie. It's a movie about noise and absence of noise. Music has been a convention in films since the beginning. Scores have been in films since the beginning. Portrait of a Lady on Fire removed its music, removed its score, removed that emotional through line that we're so used to, that has been around since the beginning. Let the characters inhabit a world and force the audience to inhabit that world with them by completely removing all those non-diegetic elements we're so used to. Portrait of a Lady on Fire is not a silent movie. Portrait of a Lady on Fire is the anti-silent movie. Hey, thank you for watching. My next video is gonna be about oneers. So if you're interested in seeing the films I'm gonna cover, it'll be Gravity, Children of Men, and 1917. Until then, I guess the only thing I can say is those magic YouTube words. Please like and subscribe.